Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We would like to begin.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Jennifer Newsom-Martin, Director of the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture. I am absolutely delighted to welcome you all for this evening for our 25th annual Fall Conference. Woo! That which I also received, living tradition. We are so thrilled to have friends joining us for this year's conference, which is honestly the highlight of the fall semester for us here at Notre-Dame. I'd like to offer particular thanks to some of our special guests who have joined us this evening, including Dean Kenneth Sheevy of the College of Arts and Letters. Thank you for being here. Dean Stefanos Polyzoides of the College of Architecture, Tony and Christy DeNicola, as well as members of the DeNicola Center's Executive Advisory Committee. Of course, our beloved friend, Lou Solomon, and so many students, scholars, and guests who have traveled from far and wide to be with us this weekend. For those who might not be familiar with our work, the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture shares the richness of the Catholic moral and intellectual tradition through research, teaching, and engagement at the highest level and across a range of disciplines. We do this in four main ways. First, through our academic research and programming, of which the Fall Conference has become the centerpiece, along with numerous scholarly initiatives and several robust book series with our friends at the University of Notre-Dame Press. Secondly, our student formation program, our Sorin Fellows program for undergraduate and graduate students at Notre Dame, St. Mary's, and Holy Cross College, which I think Marco Clark is in the audience as well. Thank you, Marco, for being here, which is now 750 strong. Third, Third is our work building and supporting a culture of life, both here on campus and in the wider public square, through various conferences, initiatives, and formation opportunities. And finally, our Mission Stewardship Initiative, which assists the university in its efforts to bring to Notre Dame the very best eminent and emerging scholars whose work draws upon and engages the Catholic moral and intellectual tradition. Since the Center's founding, the Fall Conference has been our largest annual event, and indeed is the University of Notre Dame's largest interdisciplinary academic conference, a truly unique and exciting gathering of scholars, artists, students, and friends from around the globe who come together every year to grapple with some of the most vital questions of ethics, culture, and public policy today. This year's gathering is a particularly meaningful one for us at the De Nicola Center. It is not only the 25th installment of the Fall Conference, but also the first conference without our founding director, David Solomon, and our dear friend and permanent Senior Distinguished Research Fellow of the Center, Alistair McIntyre, who both passed away earlier this year. It was David's vision that first brought the Fall Conference to life, drawing together students and scholars in his characteristically warm and capacious way for meaningful dialogue and exchange around themes that go to the very heart of what it means to be human: beauty, freedom, justice, poverty, human identity, modernity, the family, good and evil, man in the state, creation, friendship. David's successor and my predecessor as director, the incomparable Carter Sneed, continued that grand tradition and grew both the center and the conference to new heights, where we now routinely welcome more than 1,000 guests and friends to Notre Dame every year for what has become a not-to-be-missed event. Over 25 conferences, the De Nicola Center has featured some of the world's most distinguished scholars, artists, and practitioners, some of whose photos you saw in the wonderful slideshow before we began this evening. With names like Charles Taylor, Jean Bethke Elshtain, Nobel laureate James Heckman, Ratzinger Prize-winning architect Etsuro Soto, Mary Ann Glendon, John Finnis, Stanley Hauerwas, Remy Bragg, Michael Sandel, Dana Gioia, Jonathan Lear, and of course, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, Alistair McIntyre, who spoke at every fall conference since its founding and continue to inspire, challenge, and yes, provoke audiences until 2023. His presence as a fixture at the De Nicola Center and his generosity at every fall conference have left an indelible mark on this gathering, as surely as David's generosity and vision did. In short, this conference would not be what it is today without the contributions of David Solomon and Alistair McIntyre, and we can think of no better way to honor their work and memory than to gather and reflect on what we have inherited from those who have gone before us, and how we will carry that inspiration into the future. As always, their spirit continues to animate our work, and we remember them in our prayers and our conversations this weekend. Tonight, we will begin our reflection on tradition and its dynamic and lived nature as it is considered across the disciplines. Over the next 3 days, we will consider a wide range of moments throughout history that continue to shape our understanding of ourselves and of the world. This year marks the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea in 325. 862 years ago, the cornerstone of Notre-Dame de Paris was laid in the presence of Pope Alexander III. Nearly 705 years ago, Dante completed his Divine Comedy. 500 years ago, Renaissance composer Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina was born, 250 years ago, the first shots were fired in the American Revolutionary War. 184 years ago, Father Edward Sorin was dispatched to Indiana, a year later founding the University of Notre-Dame. 100 years ago, hillbilly Thomist Flannery O'Connor was born in Savannah, Georgia. 60 years ago, the Second Vatican Council closed in Rome. 37 years ago, the Notre Dame Fighting Irish won their last national title. A tradition which we hope will soon be extended. 30 years ago, Pope St. John Paul II promulgated Evangelium Vitae, his transformative encyclical in the Gospel of Life. And just earlier this month, on November 1st, St. John Henry Newman was proclaimed a Doctor of the Church by Pope Leo XIV. In almost 150 presentations throughout this weekend, we will consider how these and other discrete moments through the centuries have contributed to the deposit of tradition that continue to shape our world today. In our literature, theology, philosophy, medicine, law, bioethics, art, film, music, theater, architecture, political science, and more. It really promises to be a truly exciting 3 days. Just a brief housekeeping note before we begin. To make it easier to facilitate our question and answer portion after tonight's presentation, we will be inviting guests to submit their questions online, which I can then pose to our speaker as time allows. So please, if you would take a moment now to scan the QR code that you'll see on the screens at the front of the room so you could submit your questions during the presentations. We'll be sure to post this again at the conclusion of the evening remarks as well. And now, all that said, it is my honor and my deep privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, Philippe Villeneuve. Born in Boulogne-Billancourt near Paris, Villeneuve has long been a prominent figure in the delicate and demanding field of architecture, a calling he embraced from a young age. After obtaining the prestigious DPLG degree in architecture in 1989, he pursued a career deeply committed to heritage preservation. His recognition in the field of heritage conservation culminated in his appointment as architect-in-chief for historic monuments at the Domaine National de Chambord in 2011, followed in 2013 by his appointment to the same position at the Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Paris, one of France's, of course, most iconic monuments. In 2013, he was also made Chevalier of the Arts and Letters, a distinction that honors his dedication to art and to culture. Since the fire of April 15th, 2019, he has directed the reconstruction and restoration of this world-renowned cathedral, ensuring that its rebirth honors both its history and its spirit. Tonight, Villeneuve will be offering a presentation entitled Reconstruction, Restoration of Notre-Dame de Paris, Doctrinal, Technical, Aesthetic, and Liturgical Choice. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
I'm going to try to speak English with a beautiful accent, a French accent. And it's the first time I'm going to read a conference because I improvise the other times. But now I wanted to change the subject. It was not the story of the restoration, but to place Notre-Dame de Paris in the history of the world, of the architecture, of the art, of the structure, in the history, in the evolution, and after the restoration and the end, why we choose to restore Notre-Dame after the fire, like we restored it. I'm going to try to explain it. Ça va, c'est bien.
Oui, ça va très
bien.
C'est
très bien. Merci. So, Notre-Dame de Paris is today the most famous cathedral in the world. The fire and its reconstruction have indeed placed it before the eyes of the entire planet. But already, from the moment of its construction, je suis déjà en retard. But already, from the moment of its construction, it was famous, admired and copied. Then she was exceeded. And I continue. It has gone through history with more or less success, used, adapted, vandalized, abandoned, threatened, restored, magnified. It became one of the symbols of Paris. Even centuries also made it an essential milestone in the history of architecture, and more particularly of so-called Gothic architecture. In 2019, it suffered a terrible fire that was for it the greatest disaster in its history. It's several slides to explain the place of the cathedral in the history of France and the different steps she lived during the 8.5 century of its history. It's totally improvised. C'est bien, hein? I verify. So, it's magnified, but in 2019, it suffered a terrible fire that was for it the greatest disaster in its history. She had escaped everything, the wars, the vandalism of the revolution, the accidents or collapse like other cathedrals, the Nazi barbarism, and finally, we thought we were going to lose it. This fear was, in fact, exaggerated, motivated above all by the horror of the vision of Notre-Dame on fire, and unfortunately illustrates our time. But Notre-Dame demonstrates the genius of the architect who designed it and who had anticipated this situation, as in so many other cathedrals that are also victims of such disaster. For the Gothic architecture of cathedrals, already so mastered at Notre-Dame when it was only in infancy, is the expression of a religion, a faith, a religious doctrine, and the genius of the Christian Middle Age. It's not the context of this intervention that one can exhaustively and perfectly define what Gothic architecture is. Simplifying and approaching the subject from the exclusive angle of the cathedral, it's usual to consider that Gothic architecture is a result of a slow evolution moving from dark, semicircular Romanesque architecture to the pointed arch, ogival and luminous. We will pass over the rivalities of ecclesiastical ego. It's the result of a wide range of research as diverse and increasing the surface area of building, being able to simplify those complex surfaces, reducing supports, ensuring abundant lighting, reducing the mass and the quality of materials, reducing in principle the cost, protecting against complete destruction by fire, etc. Each technical advance often gave rise to other problems that were solved in the next building. This is how we see in each cathedral advances aimed at perfecting and surpassing the previous one. It was also, and above all, to respond to the program drawn up by the bishop and cathedral chapter that this architecture were developed. There was certainly a practical program, nave, side aisles, number of portals, number of chapel, circulation, cult of relics, etc., but obviously a theological and liturgical program. This evolved during the Middle Age. Thus, the Marian cult developed greatly at the end of the 12th century, taking precedence over that of the proto-martyr, Saint Etienne. This is why the first large cathedrals were often dedicated to Saint Etienne, such as, for example, Sens, which preceded Paris by a very short time, which was dedicated to the Virgin. The cult of relics also held such place that a building had to take into account the flow, the access and the views offered to pilgrims. Several architectural arrangements, such as ambulatories, result from this practice. But it was at the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis that the architecture was in perfect harmony with a practical program, but also with a particular theological and liturgical vision that would spread throughout the world, giving birth to the Gothic architecture of cathedral. Saint-Denis, a powerful abbey north of Paris, was directed from 1122 by Abbot Surger, a close advisor to kings Louis VI and Louis VII. Soon enough, he devoted himself to the reconstruction of the abbey. If the Western Massif, completed in 1140, still has the massiveness of the Romanesque, despite heavy ribald vault, the choir, completed 4 years later, in 1144, has nothing to do with it. The Abbey of Saint-Denis was directed long before Surger in the 8th century by Abbot Hilduin. He worked on and propagated texts written by a certain Denis, known as the Areopagite. There was obviously a great confusion between Saint-Denis, the first bishop of Paris, martyred between the 1st and the 3rd centuries, and buried in the eponymous abbey, and Denis the Areopagite, who is thought to have lived in the 5th century. To sum up, he thought, God is light. Surger then wanted to translate this theology into sacred architecture. The church was to be the representation of heaven on earth, the heavenly Jerusalem, the dwelling place of God, had to be defended by high vaults. This is why the western facade is crowned with battlements. The sanctuary, Holy of Holies, is surrounded by a wall of brightly colored stained glass windows, symbolizing the precious stone of which the walls are made. The monstrous and frightening gargoyles defend the fortress. The Gothic ambulatory and its crown of open chapels, largely illuminated by stained glass windows, was born. The pillars are thin. The ribald vaults cover all the space with ease. The lightness of the Gothic was born. The growing scale and complexity of the program led to the increase in size and complexity of the plan, articulation and layering of the volumes, and required constant structural innovation. The quest for light was accompanied by the quest of hate. And all this came to an abrupt halt in November 1284, with the collapse of the vaults of the choir of the Cathedral of Saint-Pierre de Beauvais, which rise to 48 and 20 meters high. However, will still inhabited by the race of records, the architect and the clergy of Beauvais built a huge tower at the crossing without thinking that the nave would have been useful. It collapsed, from the top of his 105 and 3, no, n'importe quoi, 153. J'ai un trou. Hein? Oui, ben quoi, c'est 53. 53. Yes, but it's because more funny when I send it because no, you don't sleep because it's better when I improvise, but and yes, 150, voilà. Bon, boom. And Beauvais remained unfinished. Ogival architecture born in the Île-de-France, in Saint-Denis, was thus called Opus Francigenum, or French art. It covered Europe. When the period called the Renaissance arrived in Italy, then in France and elsewhere, an Italian architect named Vasari, you know Vasari, to whom we owe the painting of the Dome of Duomo, Florence, so fit to describe the ogival architecture as Gothic, in reference to the barbarians. This bon mot in French remained. The bishopric of bishopric. It's for the accents because of Paris depended until the 17th century on the archbishopric of Sens. It was therefore hierarchically normal for Sens to have a new cathedral before Paris. And work began in 1130, and the cathedral was dedicated to Saint Etienne. Nevertheless, Paris was the city of the royal power. It was therefore normal that a new building should also be built there, dedicated to Our Lady, and began in 1163. Between the two, the choir of Saint-Denis was consecrated in 1144. I'm completely, yes. It's the plan of Sens. So the initial plan of Saint-Étienne de Sens was simple. A nave flanked by simple aisles, no transept, a semicircular chevet, choir, and a single axial chapel. The elevation had 3 levels, arcades on the ground floor, triforium, and height vaults, and height windows, and after the vaults. The vaulting is 6-parted. For the height vaults, quadripartite for the lower parts. The height of the vault reaches 24 meters. Mention should be made of the collegial church near Sens of Mantes, built in 1140 onwards, whose plan is quite similar, but the interior elevation are very close to Notre-Dame. The plan of Surgeus Abbey Church in Saint-Denis preserves in the middle the Carolingian nave, which is framed to the west by the powerful western massif with 2 towers, and to the east by the choir with an ambulatory on which radiating chapels open without any real separation, undulating between small columns and wide bays. Excuse. The original plan of Notre-Dame de Paris is also simple, with a nave, without projecting transept. Some even think that it was not initially planned as in Sens, but with double aisles and double ambulatory. It should be noted that the early Christian Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome was borrowed from the 5 naves, placing Paris as a royal city on the same level as Rome, the city of the popes. There are no side chapels, just like in Sens. The elevation is on 4 levels with a large arcade, then the galleries, a triforium, and finally the height bay. The height vaults are 6-parted and culminate at 35 meters. It's noticeable that the plans of this building only grow I don't remember, no, excuse me, on a ground in lace, which and hate. I'm sorry. Also, new problems arise to architects in responding technically of these developments. How can we light such large and tall buildings? How to cover them? How can we censor their stability? How can they be protected from destruction by fire? This last question, this last question is undoubtedly the most important one that was posed to the project managers. How many cathedrals have indeed disappeared from top to bottom? The first cathedral often followed one or another after terrible fire. Then, it seemed then all this finally stopped. At Notre-Dame, after the fire, it was found that the stones of the pillar, 2 pillars of the nave, at the foot of which the timbers of the spire had fallen after piercing the vaults, were rebrified, split and displaced due to the burning of the timbers after they fell. If the woods had continued to burn longer, the pillars would have collapsed by the splintering of the split stone. And like a house of cards, the armchair bay, not only of the nave, but also of the galleries and aisles with the flying buttress, would have collapsed. However, it was the very large timber section of Villeneuve's spire that pierced the vaults, not those of the medieval framework. For this were of small section with a raffle forming of firm. And when they collapsed, they lay down on the vault without shaking them. The vault was therefore the solution to protect against the ravage of the fires. The master building of Notre-Dame knew this. He had learned it from his master and taught it to his successors. The Cathedral of Paris, when completed around 1218, was the largest building in Christendom. She was also a record holder of several occasions, each time dethroned thereafter. Excuse me. The vaults were the highest ever erected. The western rose, with its 9 meters diameter, was the largest that had been seen. When the arms of the transept were lengthened to align with the sides chapels that had successively occupied the space between the abutments of the flying buttress, the roses of Notre-Dame, with nearly 30 meters in diameter, were again the largest ever built. The flying buttress sprang up in a single flight and crossed 15 meters of span with only 16 of thickness at the tangent. However, while the design of the building provided innovative, technical and structural response, it only managed to respond imperfectly to the quest for light. Indeed, the cathedral was dark in the eyes of its sisters. The high bay were too small and located far too high to be able to illuminate anything other than the upper parts of the walls of the nave and choir, and not enough to the rest of the building. Jean-Baptiste Lassus and Eugène Viollet-le-Duc have also restored this original elevation in the arm of the transept and half bay of the nave and the choir. This is why, enriched by the experiences of the other cathedral, it was decided in the 13th century to enlarge the base, the high window, by merging the triforium with the bay, so as to lengthen it considerably and structure it in. Ooh, it's not too difficult for you to follow me because you know it's the first time I do that. I'm not. Because it's very difficult, and I don't want to continue. And structure to lancet surrounded by the simple oculus. Certainly, the cathedral was lighter, but its width still made it difficult to light the aisles and the ambulatory. The 13th century was for Notre-Dame not only that of its completion, but also a period of profound modification. For, in addition to the bay just mentioned, it was also necessary to modify the roof of the galleries, formerly leaning against the gutter walls and ventilated by the triforium. From one slope they went to two, then to stone stabs in the 19th century. The frameworks of the large attic were in turn modified to rest under raised levels, so spacing well above the extradoors of the vault. The flying buttresses were then equipped with channels to collect and discharge rainwater. The two arms of the transepts were lengthened and equipped with gigantic roses. Nevertheless, it's striking to note that architectural design of the 12th century was imperturbably followed until the completion of the cathedral a century and a half later, while at the same time the galleries and sexpartite vaults were abandoned at Notre-Dame de Chartres and in the other cathedral. Should we see a lack of imagination in this? Certainly not. In this era when innovation abounded, and when nothing was beautiful or daring enough to praise God. Here, Maurice de Sully's project seemed to be scrupulously pursued until its completion. Perhaps the original architectural choice satisfied the clergy, or the beauty of the choir was so admired that the initial plan was continued to the tower. Or again, architectural harmony and homogeneity was preferred to sudden eruption of novelties. It's little. It's very important, the S. The completed masterpiece, therefore, did not undergo any modifications or additions over the first century of its history. But with the Renaissance and the Counter-Reformation, the time of cathedral was now over, and the age of enlightenment sought it in building and in Notre-Dame in particular. Light had indeed become indispensable for reading during Mass, whose ritual and liturgy had changed during the Counter-Reformation. Thus, church were adapted to this change, as we could see in France, following the Second Vatican Council in the 1916s. Vandals are not only revolutionary. J'ai pas pu m'empêcher. The colored stained glass windows in the Middle Age were therefore removed, with the notable exception of the large roses, which were even restored. The walls and the vaults were whitewashed. The paving was redone by removing the beautiful funerary stabs in favor of a black and white checkerboard, and above all, the choir was given a new layout. This was the materialization of a woo made by Louis XIII. Oui, non, moi c'est bien.
13.
Faut qu'ils apprennent un peu.
Yeah, okay.
who consecrated is the kingdom of the Virgin after the long awaited birth of the future Louis le Grand. Là, c'est plus facile de dire Louis le Grand que Louis XIV. You know, for this, Robert de Cotte was called upon the design and decoration of red and white marbles, enhanced with gilded bronzes for the Gothic pillars and arcade, which are now semicircular. The floors with marble making bore the arms of France, and the high altar were placed in front of the Pietà, accompanied on either side by Louis XIII, n'est-ce pas, and Louis XIV, sculpted by Coiseau and Cousteau. Carved oak statues depicted the life of the Virgin Mary. Finally, the medieval rood screen, already hidden in the 17th century, was this time demolished. The pieces were built under the pavement. They were found during the excavation of the Reconstruction site to make a way from a round iron gate. Thus, adorned the Gothic cathedral was concealed as much as possible, and hook, gargoyles, pinnacle were also removed, both for the risk of falling and to remove these old-fashioned stones. The state of the cathedral was such as that the revolutionary had little to break, except for the statuary of the portals and the statue of the Gallery of Kings. And it was not they who decided with a vengeful gesture to put down the arrow, the spire of the crossing, because it simply turned to collapse. When Napoleon I decided coronation, it was Notre-Dame de Paris and not Reims, the cathedral of King, that he chose as it is sitting. The dilapidated one was cleverly concealed by ephemeral and theatrical sets to the right. Shortly afterwards, Notre-Dame would soon regain its place as Queen of Cathedral. Several things place it at the center of society. A certain nationalism, exacerbated after the war that ravaged Europe, developed in many countries that were once enemies and never really reconciled. Literature, science, history, art, archaeology, and architecture were indisputable means of demonstrating its superiority or legitimacy. Notre-Dame was a veritable banner for France aimed at demonstrating that Gothic architecture was born in France and was, therefore, the expression of its genius with spread throughout Europe. In addition, the monuments that had become historic were considered the heritage of a rich and civilized society. In addition, the cathedral of the capital had to be worthy of a country that could legitimately dominate Europe. Finally, the church, which has been badly treated during the revolution, saw it as an opportunity to regain its influence and regain its power in society. Victor Hugo is considered to be one who, in France, awakened conscience to restore this marvel of yesteryear by publishing the novel Notre-Dame de Paris in 1831. But already in Germany, Goethe was moved by Gothic cathedral, just like the painter and architect Carl Friedrich Schinkel painted improbable cathedrals. In England, it was John Ruskin who took an interest in monuments, not to raise them, but to praise their romantic and old-fashioned beauty. In the first quarter of the 19th century, Europe was so driven by a craze for the Middle Ages, troubadours, cathedrals, and castles. And from a style that was still hesitant and still full of classicism, and as we study its architecture and style, the Gothic gradually reappeared passing from the troubadour style to the neo-Gothic style. As a striking proof, the coronation of Charles X in Reims was an opportunity to deploy a fashionable decor of Gothic inspiration. At that time, architects were more trained to study and create in the neoclassical style, jungling with architectural orders, pediments and mansard roof. Romanesque or Gothic architecture were not studied. And the first attempts at construction in the neo-Gothic style were not very skillful due to a lack of in-depth knowledge of medieval architecture, or took on an architectural fantasy character worthy of the fabrics of the Ancien Régime. At the same time, a service of historical monuments was created in 1813 by Guizot, Minister of Interior, for whom, said what he said, it's a serious disorder and a great weakening in a nation that forgetfulness and disdain for the past. He thus created the position of Inspector General of Historical Monuments, who, by crisscrossing the whole of France, was to draw up a list of remarkable monuments. This position was held by Ludovic Vitet, but above all by Prosper Mérimée, who initiated the classification of historic monuments. A young man immersed in the arts and architecture through his family, frequenting the court and traveling extensively, refused to follow the teaching of the academy. An outstanding draughtsman with a remarkable analytical mind, he decided to learn on his own. His name was Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, my father. Just I not genius. Very early fascinated by medieval architecture, in this slide you can see some little subjects that Viollet-le-Duc decided to study. For example, to the right you have the mountains, the Alps. He decided to analyze the alpage with a geometrical drawing, and each thing was precisely analyzed. Ça y est, je m'éloigne de mon texte, ça va pas du tout. He analyzed it in details from the rationalist point of view. It's very important, the rationalism. Everything was drawn, analyzed, compared, and constituted an indisputable mass of knowledge, which is still authoritative today, which he published in a very large number of books, among which the obviously cannot ignore the Dictionnaire raisonné de l'architecture française du XIe au XVIe siècle. Viollet-le-Duc is a fascinating character because, gifted with an extraordinary power of work, he tackled all the subjects that a building could present, from the structure to the furniture, on which he also wrote a dictionary. From clothes to decoration, he could be an architect and restorer, while being an architect of his time, who was not averse to using new materials or products for monuments, or who thought about innovative solutions to cover vast space. In this, he joins, among others, the architects of the Middle Age. He also joins the great figure of the Renaissance. So his abundant activity, such as Léonard de Vinci. You have the same character of Léonard de Vinci and the Viollet-le-Duc. Viollet-le-Duc is best known as having been one of the main player in the restoration of historical monuments in France in the middle of the 19th century. His experience began at a very young age, at 24 old, when Prosper Mérimée entrusted him with the rescue of the Madeleine de Vézelay, which no one wanted to risk restoring. He succeeded in this, and for him began a rich career. His observations and his projects enabled him to elaborate, for the first time in France, a doctrine of restoration. For him, unity of style had to take precedence. This is how he wrote in his famous Resonant Dictionary this no less famous definition of the term restore. It's enough. The word and the thing are modern. So it's very important now, and it was very important just after he died to think that it was the first one who began to open the way for the restoration of the historical monuments. Before, nobody. Restoring a building is not about maintaining, repairing, or redoing it. It's about restoring it to a complete state that may never have existed at a given time. Many people understand this sentence in a bad sense and don't understand. It's completely absurd. It's not to restore something who doesn't exist. Yes, it doesn't exist perhaps, but at a given time. Everything is said, but you have to be careful with every word, because this sentence, at first glance paradoxical, is in fact perfectly logical, because the most important part of this sentence, which explains Viollet-le-Duc's vision, is at a given moment. Because of this fact, we can admit that the vision that is proposed to us of a monument is right, but makes elements that had never done so coexist. For example, the restitution of the small roses of the triforium of Notre-Dame in the transept. And now, the restoration and the work of Viollet-le-Duc and Jean-Baptiste Lassus. Because we always speak about Viollet-le-Duc for Notre-Dame, but we always forget Jean-Baptiste Lassus. Jean-Baptiste Lassus was older than Viollet-le-Duc. He had many experiences to restoration, like Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. And he took the young Viollet-le-Duc in his team. Also, the cathedral had not undergone major modification or addition during its history, apart from the interior fighting and the construction by Soufflot of a large sacristy, and the disembowelment by the same architect of the portal of the Last Judgment, at the request of the clergy. It had not been maintained in a respectful manner due to a lack of sufficient means, knowledge, and skills. It had been slowly stripped of all that characterized its delicate decoration and its original architecture. Pinnacles, finials, hooks, gargoyles, and balustrade had been purged. The abandonment of the flying buttress had been consolidated with stone veneers without structural problems. Lead drone pipes, had been laid without regard of the architecture. I have to show you many things. Has been removed, yes. Lead drone pipes, has been laid without regard for the architecture. The roof were leaking, and the spire of the crossing, built in the 13th century, has been removed for fear of collapse, and not by the referee, as I said. Disinterest and incompetence almost made the monument disappear. In 1842, the government of Louis Philippe decided to launch a competition for the restoration of the cathedral. The team formed by Jean-Baptiste Lassus and Eugène Viollet-le-Duc won, and the work began in 1845 and lasted 20 years. In their project, the architects are committed to conserving, consolidating, and restoring with a religious discretion, with complete abnegation of all personal opinions. While going of the monument, the wealth and brilliance of which he has been striped. It's in the text. So, to restore structural stability, the flying buttress and abutment were rebuilt, the pinnacles and gargoyles restored, and the vaults consolidated. The rose of the south arm of the transepts, which was collapsing under the weight of the gable, was dismantled and rebuilt more solidly, and by making it rotate slightly for a better transmission of the loads. The statuary of the portal and the gallery of the kings were restored, taking as model the cathedral of the same period. The portal of the Last Judgment was restored to its original layout with the restoration of the tympanum and the trumeau with Christ's blessing. An abundance of gargoyles and hook was restored or added. This is how Viollet-le-Duc and Lassus create the chimeras of the upper gallery of the Western Massif. It has been claimed that these sculptures were a pure invention of the architect. If formally this is true, there was indeed sculpture in this level, as evidenced by the engraving of 1699. And in the text of the Baron de Guilherme, in this description of the cathedral, which describes the remains of animal clothes on the railing of the gallery. And if you see the details of this facade, you can see the little form of, it's not hook, but it's really fantasy or sculpture. So I don't suppose that we say that Viollet-le-Duc creates and did n'importe quoi.
Nonsense.
Voilà.
Anything else? Yeah.
I don't
Whatever.
support it.
Yeah.
Amen. The Saturday, excuse me, an abundance of gargoyles and hooks were restored. Ben non, je vous l'ai déjà dit ça. Voilà. It was to see if you follow me. Their work is meticulously recorded in a diary, and we can still consult the figurative attachment, the stone-by-stone records of their interventions. The rose windows of the western facade was dismantled, and while the stained glass windows were traditionally laid in rebate in the stones of the tracery, it was decided to create an iron form placed behind them, and then the restored stained glass windows were fixed on it. The iron thus reinforced the arch above the rose and also gave it more depth. The interior was also restored with the creation of paint decoration in the chapels of the choir and nave, and the creation of the stained glass windows in all the bay of the cathedral. Their intervention went so far as to create the liturgical furniture, reliquaries, candelabra, etc. The layout of the choir was reviewed. However, the presence of the sculpture by Cousteau and Coiseau, as well as the Angel's Passion and the stalls, which was difficult to avoid, forced Viollet-le-Duc to abandon his Gothic project. The arcades nevertheless regained their pointed arches and capital after the removal of the marbles. The bay was fitted with new stainless windows made according to the principle of archaeological stainless, with the use of the same materials and technicals of the Middle Age. An art lost in favor of painted glass, which is closer to a painting than to a stainless windows. Finally, the two architects built a new sacristy. To do this, they demolished the one built by Soufflot. But by Soufflot, he destroyed the judgment door, principal portal, but he also creates the Panthéon. It's a masterpiece of architecture. Yes. The project presented for the competition provides for the restitution of the 13th century spire that had been removed in the 1792, octagonal in plan. It was composed of an open work floor decorated with gables and hooks, and a simple needle covered in lead without decoration. It has been said that the premature death of Lassus in July 1857, no, 57.
57?
57, yes. Fred Viollet-le-Duc's creativity. The fact remains that the new spire project drew up in October 18. Je sais plus, j'ai dit des bêtises, 57. 57, yes. Was approved by the ministry in March 1858, built in 80 months. It was completed in 1861 with the installation of the copper statue. The posterity of Viollet-le-Duc is very important. Viollet-le-Duc, both because of his talent and his close connection to power, had a flourishing and rich career. He could not, as much in opposition to his doctrinal point of view as out of jealousy or annoyance, but had a few enemies. As soon as he died in 1879, after a forced exile in Lausanne after the defeat of Napoleon III in 1870, his overly radical way of restoring a monument and his doctrine of unity of style were questioned. It's easy to criticize him again today, but let's put his action in historical context. Who before him had dedicated himself to understanding, analyzing, restoring, and saving heritage? Who could he follow or listen to? As he himself writes, the word and the thing are modern. As the heritage was classified and restored, the chief architect of monument historics were confronted with problem, reflection, and choice of restoration party. Each monument poses different problems that cannot necessarily be solved by following any doctrine. Successive experiments, both technical and scientific, have made it possible to create a corpus of doctrine. Ah ben non. It was good. Major events such as the destruction during the Two World War brought architects face to face with new situations. Thus, Henri Deneux, who was in charge of the Cathedral de Reims before the First World War, and who had carried out a survey of the wooden framework of the cathedral, chose to rebuild the framework in reinforced cement slabs assembled with a wooden case, in the manner of the frameworks of Philibert Delorme, because of the lack of food, the lack of transport and men in the aftermath of the wars. Would he have chosen this restoration party in another context? We don't know. More recently, the Basilica of Saint-Cernin in Toulouse had numerous waterproofing problems, alteration of the stones, and the merit of Viollet-le-Duc's project could be discussed. Should provisions that were harmful of the conservation of the monuments be renewed on the pretext that they were the result of Viollet-le-Duc's work? Or should this device be changed, even if it means profoundly calling into question the restoration of the 19th century to ensure the durability of the monument? The second solution was chosen. It gave rise to a large number of questions and controversies because it was indeed a matter of doctrine that was more than a technical problem. The result is, from my own point of view, hybrid, not having restored provision prior to Viollet-le-Duc, but creating a state that never existed. It's not the same thing that Viollet-le-Duc had never existed at a moment. Here it's more, it's not a good solution because if you compare, it's perhaps too small, but l'état,
The stage?
the sale of these monuments before the restoration of Viollet-le-Duc, you had many dispositions were built for several wars. Donc you had defensive dispositives above the vaults. And Viollet-le-Duc destroys this disposition, and the new restoration destroy Viollet-le-Duc, but create another disposition which is not really the restitution, but evocation. So for me, it's a problem. So if you want to restore the monument before Viollet-le-Duc, you restore completely before, like it was before Viollet-le-Duc. We have many photography, you have many documents, graphic documents, so you can go to this point. But in the same time, you can consider that the project of Viollet-le-Duc belongs to the history of the monuments. So you haven't to destroy a page of the history of the monuments. And for me, it's not acceptable. But I'm at the end of my career, so... I'm a little... yes. And this manner to do, we can call this dérestauration in French. In order not to create a fake, it's sometimes chosen to restore the monument by showing the new material, frankly, or even to place, for example, a stone cube in the absence of a sculptured capital. It is also sometimes chosen to integrate a contemporary construction into partially destroyed or rehabilitated monuments. This was practiced in the aftermath of the Second World War, or even today. And you can see at the left the Cathedral Saint-Lô, which was completely destroyed. The face before the war, the First World War, you could see two towers with two spire stone and a wonderful facade, completely destroyed and restored. And they decided to leave a trace of the destruction of the war, like a cicatrice.
A scar.
A scar. Bah oui, a scar. Yes. In order of common rules and prescription to guide restorators in the light of the different experiences across Europe, a charter was drawn up and signed in Venice in 1964, notably by France. It's very important to recall that France signed this document because somebody in France don't want to, because of the stained glass. It should be noted that the valid contribution of all period to the construction of a monument must be respected, unity of style not being a goal to be achieved during the restoration. Similarly, when a building is sufficiently documented, the last known state must be preferred. It's these rules that we have to respect. And as I said at the beginning, yes, it's a rule, but perhaps this rule cannot be applied on one monument in a moment. It's not easy to follow doctrine. It's very difficult. But you have to know that they exist. And after you create your own doctrine. It's interesting to note that the Venice Charter was signed by Western countries, heirs to a Judeo-Christian culture. This is very much impregnated with a certain perception of what is venerable. The older it is, the more valuable it is. Moreover, the word venerable applies to something or someone who inspires respect, especially because of his or her seniority. The cult of relics, so developed in the Middle Age, is rooted in a large part of the Christian West. In 1994, in Japan, a document was signed at the Nara Conference on Authenticity in the framework of the World Heritage Convention, in cooperation with UNESCO, IRCOM, ICOMOS. The concern from the protection of heritage then became global and went beyond the Western framework. However, we know that authenticity for Western is not considered in the same way by East Asians. Thus, in Japan, some century-old Shinto temples are ritually dismantled and rebuilt. The materials are new, but they are the same as those used in the past. The techniques are also the same. New, it's nevertheless considered authentic. For the Westerner, a new material, even integrated into an old building with the same techniques, will not be authentic, and the whole building thus loses its venerability. You can see the difference is very important between East or West. And because of this context, we reflect, we do a very great reflection to present a project and how to restore Notre-Dame after the disaster. The fire, it was noted with relief that even if the burning cathedral has been an atrocious sight of the whole world that made it face in complete disappearance, the damage was limited. The framework, the roof, and the spire has been completely destroyed. 3 portions of the vaults has been gutted. The paving has been broken by the fall of stone and wood. Water was trickling everywhere, and I seeped into the heart of the masonry. And the whole thing has been polluted by the lead dust. On the other hand, no stained glass window has been destroyed. No flying buttress have given way. The great organ was intact. The furniture, except for the altar, has not been touched. In red, you can see all the destruction of the monument. You can see it's only the roof, the spire, and the ground. The 5 years deadline imposed by President Macron could therefore be met. However, the later and Prime Minister Edouard Philippe declared the very next day that an international competition will be launched for the reconstruction of the spire. It's a specialty of the France. Such a competition would certainly have made the delay untenable. In addition, as France was bound by the Venice Charter and the Nara document, the reconstruction of the spire could not have been other than that of Viollet-le-Duc. But you will have to respect the rules. While projects abounded, each crazier than the last, megalomaniac or ironic, irreverent or ignorant of Gothic architecture, and Notre-Dame, a debate opposite those who wanted to rebuild Viollet-le-Duc spire and those who wanted a contemporary gesture. So, and during when the architect, drawn a project, yes, I say, yes, it's very bad, it's good for me, I continue to work for the restoration of the Viollet-le-Duc spire. So, c'est mieux hein, quand j'improvise, hein, finalement.
Ah oui,
vraiment,
oui.
Parce que là, on
Oui, je suis d'accord.
vous n'emmerdez pas trop, parce que moi, je m'emmerde. Hein. Non, ça va. Bon, d'accord. Donc, faut pas faire ça. J'ai entendu qu'il paraît que c'est pas bien. Ils s'aiment pas ça, les Américains. Ils s'aiment pas. Vous savez. Oui, bah oui, bon, bah j'arrive. Bon, oh. Bon. So, what had become of Notre-Dame in Paris from its creation through its restoration until April 2019? Timeless and immovable icon, symbol of an old country with a glorious past but still turned towards the future, or on the contrary, nostalgia and immobile, thus wanting to rebuild the disappeared spire was for some the prerogative of the ancient, without audacity, without imagination, lazy, while wanting to continue to add to this monument a layer of the time and previous generation had done in the past with that of the moderns. I'm an ancient. The dare to put an architecture on a masterpiece like Notre-Dame, it was necessary to understand and respect the building in all its aspects, but also to have enough modesty not to try to mark in an indelible and egotistical way, no pun intended, this cathedral whose names are unknown, most of the architects who worked on it. The debates also concern the materials for rebuilding the roof. We then found ourselves immersed in the early 19th century, when cast iron or iron were then the most modern materials and reputed to be resistant to fire. Concrete was also favored by some. Others thought they were more modern than they were by offering the lighter titanium for the cover. All these solutions could be rejected, both because of their real ineffectiveness against fires and because of the structural imbalance they would bring if they were implemented. It's imperative to have a heavy framework and a roof to ensure the stability of the vaults. Or the lack of the feedback from certain materials whose behavior is still unknown. 200 or 300 years after their implementation. We know that concrete is not that indestructible. The famous Villeneuve framework built in the Reims Cathedral was restored a few years ago because the steels were corroding and the cement was shattering. We will not reopen the debate here, as the National Commission for Heritage and Architecture of the Ministry of the Culture had decided in favor of the identical restitution of the monument in all its destroyed parts. In accordance with the Venice Charter, the building being sufficiently documented, it can be restored without error. In accordance with the NARA documents, the materials are still available, the know-how is still used, and the building can be rebuilt. So the medieval framework was faithfully rebuilt to the dowell and to the assembly according to the survey carried out shortly before the fire by Rémy Fremont, who joined the Notre-Dame site for his purpose. Many provisions have been implemented to ensure fire safety, such as fire trusses, detections, and misting. The spire was here you can see the framework of the nave and of the choir. And you can believe me that when I walk inside, I can't imagine that there was a fire who destroyed all. Even you can feel the smell of the wood, like before, and with several years, this odor, this smelling will be more important than today. And for me, it's wonderful because I forget completely that there was a destruction of the cathedral. So I profit. They are not here, but to say all my my love for the companion we rebuilt this cathedral. It's a masterpiece, and it's today we could do that, and it's a chance for us that the fire were there were 5 or 6 years, because if the fire destroys the spire in the 18th, I'm sure that you had a concrete framework and perhaps an aluminium or a copper or I don't know what materials on the cathedral. So it's a chance for us that it arrives in our time. Yes, the spire was rebuilt just as faithfully with a few small modifications due to the engineers and insurance companies of our times, which were totally devoid of audacity. That's terrible for the restoration of old structure. If you, when I speak now, in Bordeaux, in a university, you have today, since 5 years, perhaps 6, engineers and people with white blues who don't understand how the vaults stand. They can't understand, and they said, no, it falls, because the computer said that it's not possible. The vault is done. They said, no, they are not done. I look at, no, the computer said no, so the vaults are full. It's true. I don't. You laugh, but truly, I had in front of me people who say, "No, doesn't. No, it's not possible." But it's yes, it's not important because it's engineers. But I said it because in the Middle Age we didn't need engineers. It doesn't exist. And that's why, well, perhaps for Beauvais, yes, it's we could take an engineer, but there was not didn't exist. But it's very important because today, to open the cathedral to the public, I had a commission in a prefecture, the police prefecture, who wanted that I write that the vaults are stable and couldn't fall because of we have rebuilt the vaults. Nobody can give the explanation of why it's stable, why it doesn't fall, why it doesn't collapse. We can't explain. We know, we understand that you put the stone, it's an arch, a double courbure, double courbe, ça se dit, double courbe? No. Double? Curve, double curved? Double curved? Yes, but we can give a number and say, yes, it's because of that. No, we can't. But the assurances and the prefecture and that wanted to say, so I think I don't rebuild, I restore. You know the difference between the two words? For the prefecture, it's a good thing that it's restored, so it's not my fault. But if I rebuild, I take the responsibility of an engineer, or I'm not an engineer. So that's very difficult in France. I don't know if in the United States you have the same problem, but in France it's very difficult. The cover was, in spite of more or less bona fide fears and much controversy, restored in accordance with what it was. The work was carried out according to the rules of the art. However, to give more durability to certain decorations as the reeds or the hooks and decoration of the spire, the molding and casting in one piece were chosen to avoid tears, infiltration and falls. After, so you can see several steps of the rebuilding of the spire, the roof and the decoration of lids, and you can see the scaffolding were climbed from the ground to 19.6 meters higher. And after it's finished. So I continue with the details. And in the middle, you can see one statue we turn to the spire with a regular. It's Villeneuve. We look at his own work. It's very funny because the statue is authentic. They were saved 4 days before the fire. They were restored. And if the statue had a mind, it's very funny because they don't know that the fire destroyed all the spire. And I think it's very funny to imagine that Viollet-le-Duc is put in the ancient place, and they like it, and they say, yes. And you will look at the last slide after, and you will understand why I'm so, je suis ici, comment dire, narquois, amusé. It's very funny for Viollet-le-Duc and for me. But the vaults have been rebuilt using the same technicals, materials as originally. Wooden arch were placed under the vaults with the exact profile before the collapse. The lying beds were it's difficult. Scrupulously. It's difficult, huh? Scrupulously restored. The mortar was lime and sand. And you can see the nave before and after. And I'm very happy because you can see the destruction, the part destroyed in the nave. And after restoration, you can absolutely not make the distinctions. You can distinguish the difference between the authentic vaults and the reconstruction. The cathedral was equipped with all the equipment necessary for its operation. Lighting is a choice of the assigned clergy. It's regrettable that the theology of light mentioned at the beginning of our discourse, it's finished, has obviously been forgotten. As you can see, I'm not sure that in the theology of the light, the vaults have to be light, like that. The light comes from outside because God is light, so it's outside. And it's through the stained glass with a wonderful color that the light have to enter in the cathedral, not from the vault. And I think it's very damaged that it's an incomprehension of what is a cathedral, what is this wonderful object to do a miracle, and it's a shame. To conclude, simply, the restoration work on Notre-Dame de Paris after the fire of 15 avril 2019 can be defined as being, and this is an oxymoron, and I think it's very funny, an authentic restitution. Thank you. I finished. I'm sorry. I give you my approach. I never do again. The next time, perhaps it's not true, I promise I don't read. I improvise it more. Thank you. I take the glass because
Thank you so much. We are bumping up a bit against the bar closing, so we're going to forego questions, and I'm delighted to invite you to continue the conversation over drinks. I wanted to give a quick thank you to Father Greg Hake, who was on hand to assist with our translation.
I'm so glad I could do so much.
You did. We're so grateful. He's an associate professor of French here, of course, as well as the superior of the Priests and Brothers at Holy Cross. So thank you, thank you. A couple reminders. Our sessions will begin tomorrow at 9 a.m. We'll have refreshments available throughout. We are not able, of course, to host our regular communal meals, but please do consult the conference website for information about dining options. Please visit our vendors in McKenna, 205 to 207. Visit our family room if you're traveling here with children. And finally, if you have not yet gotten your name tag with the all-important drink ticket in it, please feel free to see one of our staff members to get a complimentary drink ticket for this evening's reception. So please join us for refreshments, and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you.